Welcome to the Content 10X Podcast, the show where content creators learn how to harness the power of content repurposing. And now, your host, Amy Woods.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Content 10X podcast. I'm your host, Amy Woods, and this week I'm sharing an update on my upcoming book and how I have incorporated repurposing into the whole book project. So yeah, it's really exciting news. If you haven't heard me mention it before, I've kind of teased it a little bit, especially on social media, but I have my first book being published later this year. It's called Content 10X, More Content, Less Time, Maximum Results. So I'm super excited about that. It really is the essential guide for anyone in the business of podcasting, blogging, vlogging, live streaming, running live events, membership site owners, because I cover everything about what repurposing is and why, all the many different ways that you can repurpose content, very practical and hands-on, and also the systems, the processes, the people that you need in place to make it all work. So I've really kind of poured my heart and soul into this book, and I can't wait for it to come out. So if everything goes to plan, it will be available to pre-order on Amazon from when I speak at Podcast Movement in August. So from August the 14th, which is super exciting. So I'm going to be speaking and exhibiting at the event, and I really hope to bring some copies along to the event so people there can get hold of them and touch them, and then they'll find out how to pre-order. But it's not just for people at Podcast Movement. At that time, you'll see lots on social media, and I'll mention on the website as well about how the book is ready for pre-order. So really exciting times ahead. But that's the update on the book. What I want to share with you in this week's podcast episode is how I created the book and how I incorporated content repurposing. So basically, when I first decided to write a book, I decided I'd get to a certain point where I had lots and lots of content that I'd repurpose into the book. So at around the 1 year point of the podcast and the blog, when I had over 52 podcast episodes and blog posts, I felt there was a lot that I'd put out there already, and maybe I had enough content that I could put that into a book. So I didn't expect to be able to lift blog posts and kind of bish bash bosh and here's a book, but I knew that the posts and the ideas shared in them, the core messages and all the time and effort that went into the various episodes and posts could form the basis of many different chapters in a book. So what I did was I planned out the book. I worked out the key sections and the chapters within each section. And it was really easy to get carried away here. It got to the point where I had to restrain myself and accept that I can write more than one book. So it was more about taking away than working out what to add. And then once I knew what I wanted in the book, I looked at all of my content and worked out for each chapter, did I already have content to repurpose into that chapter, or did I need to create something new? So it was all about identifying the gaps in my content. For some chapters, I had not just one, but 10 podcast episodes and blog posts that could go into that chapter. And then for some, it was simply one. And then, as I mentioned, for some, it was none. And that was identified as a gap. Now, where I saw any gaps in my content, that was fantastic, because that meant that I'd identified an upcoming podcast episode. So it was a good way of then refreshing my upcoming content schedule and making sure that I was going to create content that would be great for my audience, because I'd identified it as a key chapter in the book. So I knew it would be something people would want. I could create that, and then that could go into the book. So it was all about making sure that I made the most of both the book and all of my content. So that worked really well. And I think it's important to point out that I didn't let my content plan and dictate what was in the book. I worked out what would be a perfect book, and then I made sure that I utilized the content that I had for the book. And that's why I was able to identify gaps to help both my content, my podcast and blog, and ultimately make sure it was the best book that I could possibly produce as well. Now, in some cases where there were gaps, I didn't actually go ahead and create a podcast and then put that into the book. I did the other way around. So I couldn't help myself from actually going ahead and writing the full chapter or section of that book. And then I had the content for the book that could form the basis of a podcast episode as well. So sometimes it went the other way. I wrote first, and then that was the basis of a podcast and a blog post. Either way, that worked really, really well for having the comprehensive book in place. The actual process of writing the book took quite a lot of time, more than I imagined. I didn't actually lift posts as such, as I said, even where I did have content, for cohesiveness and because, you write differently for a book than you would blog posts and online content. There was still an awful lot of work to do in terms of wordsmithing, changing, and I'd get really carried away and start to add a lot more as well. So although I had content to base things on, it still, did take quite a bit of time to form those chapters. And what I would say, though, is it took far, far less time than starting from a blank canvas. So starting from already created content really, really worked well, so much better than if it had been a blank canvas. So the repurposing there was really, really effective. And as I said, being able to address content gaps was really effective as well. Now, the funny thing is that, for anybody who is listening right now, if you have written a book, you'll know exactly what I mean when I say this. But when you feel like you've written your last word, you don't realise just how much work is required afterwards. So a lot of editing. I'm working with an editor. She's absolutely fantastic, called Elle, and she's been helping me go through a review process on the book. Obviously, that takes time and you expect it to, but it's then all the other steps too. So designing the book cover, titles and subtitles, the back page, additional pages, things like resources page. So any resource mentioned in the book, there's a separate resource page, both online and within the book, all sorts of things, Amazon descriptions, things like that. So again, for all of this, we've made sure that we've had a repurposing mindset throughout. Things like the Amazon description can also be copy for the back page of the book. Any graphics that we've been creating. So, for example, the book cover, I'm so fortunate to run a creative agency and have a graphic design team in-house that can do all of this for me. But things like the book cover and the graphics and the various versions that we've created, all of that can be repurposed into social content and things like that. So nothing is going to waste, no effort and work is going to waste. But yep, so loads and loads of content to create in addition to the actual book. But it's all worth it. Writing a book is a really, really good thing to do. I think it's just about being smart and always thinking the big picture with the things that you create, though. So there's still a way to go. As I record this podcast episode now, we're still quite in the depths of trying to get everything ready for having physical copies at Podcast Movement and then the pre-order process. So exciting times ahead. So the question is, do you have a book in you? I think everybody probably does, especially if we're content creators. Could you follow a similar process to me? Could you get to a certain point when you have lots of content and then start to formulate how you could put that into a book? And as I mentioned, I think plan the best book possible first and then look at the content that can go in the book, address any gaps. And before you know it, perhaps you'll be in a similar position to me with a book almost ready to publish. So I'll keep you updated on the progress of the book, of course, and when it's available for pre-order, when you can buy it. And I'll keep you updated as well on any more repurposing opportunities that I've been able to leverage through the process of creating the book as well. So thank you so much for listening to this week's podcast episode. I really, really do appreciate it. If you like the show, I'd love it if you could subscribe if you haven't already and leave a review. That would really mean a lot to me. If you like any help at all with your content repurposing, then don't hesitate to get in touch. Just head on over to content10x.com. And of course, do follow us on social media as well. We share lots of tips and advice and have a bit of fun on the social platforms too. We're at content10x on all of the platforms. So thank you so much for listening, and I'll catch you in the next episode.